On a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1992, a 13-year-old girl named Isabella Reyes walked out of Edison Middle School in Miami, Florida, the same way she had walked out every school day for 2 years. She was 3 blocks from home. She'd made the walk hundreds of times. Her mother was expecting her by 3:30. Isabella never arrived. For 3 months, her disappearance was treated as a standard missing persons case. Police searched. The community organized. Her parents begged for information on Spanish-language television stations across South Florida. And then in January of 1993, federal agents arrested 17 members of a human trafficking network that had been operating in Miami for over a year, smuggling Cuban-American children back to Cuba under the direction of a wealthy businessman in Havana. This is the story of a 13-year-old girl who vanished 3 blocks from home, of a trafficking network that exploited the desperation of families divided by 90 miles of ocean, and of parents who have never stopped believing their daughter is alive. Miami, Florida in 1992 was a city defined by its Cuban population in ways that went beyond demographics. Little Havana wasn't just a neighborhood, it was the heart of a community that had rebuilt itself in exile, that carried Cuba in its language, and its food, and its music, and its unshakable conviction that someday, somehow, they would go home. The Reyes family had come to Miami in 1975, part of the wave of Cubans who left in the years following the revolution, who arrived in Florida with nothing and built lives through the kind of determined work that immigrants do when going back isn't an option. Roberto Reyes was 42 in 1992. He'd been 19 when he left Cuba with his parents and younger sister, leaving behind aunts, uncles, cousins, a whole extended family that stayed because they believed things would get better, or because they couldn't get exit permits, or because leaving felt like betrayal. He'd worked construction for 15 years, saved enough to start his own small business, a roofing company that employed 6 people and did steady work in a city that never stopped building. He was a compact, muscular man with dark hair and calloused hands, the kind of person who spoke more through action than who showed love by working 70-hour weeks so his family could have what he hadn't had. Carmen Reyes was 39. She'd come to Miami with her family in 1980 during the Mariel boat lift, the chaotic exodus of over 125,000 Cubans that had transformed South Florida. She'd been 27, newly married to Roberto, pregnant with their first child. She worked as a seamstress at a bridal shop in Coral Gables, alterations mostly, the kind of detailed work that required patience and precision. She had dark eyes, black hair she kept pulled back, and the particular warmth that made brides trust her with their dresses and their anxieties about the wedding day. They had 2 daughters. Sophia was 15 in 1992, a sophomore at Miami Senior High School, serious and focused in the way oldest children often are, carrying the weight of being the first in the family to navigate American high school, American college applications, the complicated identity of being Cuban and American and neither and both. She was studying constantly, determined to get into a good university, determined to make the sacrifices her parents had made mean something. Isabella was 13, in 8th grade at Edison Middle School. She was smaller than Sophia had been at 13, quieter in groups, but animated with people she knew well. She had her mother's dark hair worn long past her shoulders, usually pulled back in a ponytail with whatever scrunchie matched her outfit. She had her father's smile, quick and genuine, the kind that made people want to be around her. A spray of freckles across her nose that she hated with the intensity only a 13-year-old can hate a facial feature, and that Carmen told her she'd appreciate when she was older, which Isabella found impossible to believe. She loved music with a passion that went beyond casual interest. The Latin music her parents played constantly at home, the salsa and son and boleros that were the soundtrack of their household, had become her music too. She knew all the words to songs Carmen had grown up with in Cuba. She'd developed opinions about which salsa bands were superior, and would argue with her father about it at dinner. She'd been taking piano lessons since she was 10, practicing diligently in a way that surprised Carmen because most kids had to be forced to practice. Her teacher, Mrs. Kowalski, had told Carmen just a month before Isabella disappeared that Isabella had real talent, that she could pursue music seriously if she wanted to, that she was the kind of student teachers hoped for. She was close with Sophia in the way sisters can be when the age gap is just right, when the older one is protective and the younger one is admiring, and they haven't hit the years where everything becomes competition. Sophia helped Isabella with math homework when she struggled. Isabella borrowed Sophia's clothes without asking, and Sophia pretended to be more annoyed about it than she actually was. They shared a bathroom, and fought about how long Isabella took in the shower, and laughed about boys at their respective schools, and had the kind of easy intimacy that would have lasted their whole lives if Isabella had been given a whole life to live it in. The Reyes family lived in a neighborhood called Westchester, on the southwest side of Miami, in a modest single-story house with a small yard and a mango tree that produced more fruit than they could eat every summer. The neighborhood was heavily Cuban, heavily working class, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and where the boundaries between houses were porous, in the way they are in communities that function as extended family. Isabella's daily routine was simple and consistent. She walked to Edison Middle School every morning, usually with her friend Ana Castillo, who lived 2 streets over. School ended at 3:15 p.m. She walked home, usually with Ana or with another friend named Maria Torres. 3 blocks. Left on SW 8th Street, right on 97th Avenue, straight to her house on the corner. 10 minutes if she walked slowly. 7 if she hurried. Carmen worked until 5 most days, but Isabella had a key. She'd let herself in, have a snack, start homework, call Carmen at work to let her know she was home. It was a routine they'd established when Isabella started middle school. A gradual increase in independence that felt safe because the neighborhood felt safe, because everyone looked out for everyone's kids, because Carmen's sister lived 4 houses down and Isabella could go there if she needed any. Tuesday, October 13th, 1992. Started like every other Tuesday. Isabella got up at 7, had breakfast with Sofia while Roberto left for a job site, and Carmen got ready for. The girls walked together to the bus stop on 8th Street, took the bus to their respective schools. Sofia got off first, at Miami Senior High. Isabella stayed on until Edison Middle School. School was normal. Isabella had English first period, math second, history third. She ate lunch with Ana and Maria in the cafeteria, talking about a boy in their social studies class and the upcoming dance at the end of the month. She had science 4th period, PE 5th, Spanish 6th. The day was utterly ordinary in every respect. At 3:15 p.m. the final bell rang. Isabella met Ana at the front entrance like they always did. They started walking home together. Ana later told police they'd walked about 2 blocks, talking about homework and whether Ana could come over to Isabella's house on Saturday. When they reached the intersection of 8th Street and 96th Avenue, Ana turned left toward her house. Isabella continued straight. That was the last time anyone who knew Isabella saw her. She should have been home by 3:30. By 3:45, Carmen called the house from work. No answer. By 4:00, she called Roberto. He said he'd swing by the house on his way home from the job site. Probably Isabella had stopped at her aunt's house and forgotten to call. Roberto arrived home at 4:15. The house was empty. Isabella's backpack wasn't by the door where she always left it. He walked to Carmen's sister's house. Isabella wasn't there. His sister-in-law said she hadn't seen her. Roberto walked the route from school, 3 blocks, looking on both sides of the street, checking yards, looking for any sign of where she might have gone. Nothing. By 5:00, Carmen had left work and was driving the neighborhood. By 5:30, they'd called every friend whose number they had. By 6:00, Roberto was at the police station filing a missing persons report. Isabella Reyes had vanished somewhere between the intersection of 8th and 96th and her house 3 blocks away, in broad daylight, in a neighborhood full of people, without anyone seeing anything. The Miami Police Department took the missing persons report seriously from the beginning, which was not always the case in 1992 when teenagers went missing. But Isabella's age, the circumstances, and the fact that she disappeared during the short walk home from school elevated the urgency immediately. Detective Marcus Rivera was assigned to the case within hours. He was 38, had been with Miami PD for 14 years, and was himself Cuban-American, from a family that had come over in the 60s. He spoke Spanish fluently, understood the community, knew how to talk to families like the Reyes family in ways that built trust rather than distance. He sat with Roberto and Carmen in their living room Tuesday night and asked them to walk through everything. Isabella's routine, her friends, whether she'd been worried about anything, whether there had been any changes in her behavior recently, whether anyone had been bothering her or paying her unusual attention. Roberto and Carmen answered every question. Isabella was a good kid, responsible. She didn't stay out late, she didn't have a boyfriend, she got decent grades. She had the normal amount of 13-year-old drama with friends, but nothing serious. She'd been happy recently, excited about the school dance, practicing piano more because her teacher had entered her in a recital. Rivera asked if there were any custody issues, any family conflict, whether anyone might have taken Isabella. Carmen said no. Both her and Roberto's families were in Cuba except for Carmen's sister who lived 4 houses away. There was no custody dispute. No one had any reason to take Isabella. Rivera asked if they'd had any contact with anyone from Cuba, any relatives trying to reach out, any unusual letters or phone calls. Carmen hesitated, then said her mother in Havana had called 2 weeks ago. It was a rare call, expensive, but her mother had met. She'd asked about the girls, asked when Carmen might be able to visit. It had been a normal conversation, nothing strange about it. Rivera wrote it down, asked for the mother's name and location in Cuba. Carmen provided it. She asked why that mattered. Rivera said they had to check everything. By Wednesday morning, the search for Isabella had expanded to a full neighborhood canvass. Officers knocked on every door within a 6-block radius of Isabella's route home. Did anyone see a 13-year-old girl walking alone Tuesday afternoon? Did anyone see a vehicle stopping to talk to someone? Did anyone see anything unusual? Most people said no. The afternoon had been ordinary. Kids walking home from school was such a common sight that nobody paid specific attention unless something seemed wrong. A few people said they'd seen children walking, but they couldn't identify anyone specifically. The descriptions were too vague to be useful. Nobody had seen a vehicle stop in a way that seemed suspicious. Nobody had seen anyone being forced into a car. Nobody had witnessed what police believed had to have been an abduction, quick and efficient and invisible despite happening on a residential street in the middle of the afternoon. The search expanded to businesses along 8th Street. Detective Rivera personally visited every store, every restaurant, every gas station. He asked if anyone had been working Tuesday afternoon between 3 and 4. He asked if they'd seen anything unusual. He collected the names of every employee who'd been on shift and interviewed them separately. A cashier at a convenience store 2 blocks from Isabella's house said she'd seen a dark-colored car, maybe a sedan, driving slowly down 8th Street around 3:30. She couldn't describe the driver, couldn't remember the license, said she'd only noticed because the car had been going unusually slow, like the driver was looking for an address. Rivera checked if the store had security cameras. They did, but the cameras faced the interior, recording transactions, not the street. The footage was useless for identifying vehicles. Isabella's classmates were interviewed at Edison Middle School on Wednesday. Ana Castillo described walking with Isabella, splitting up at 8th and 96th. Maria Torres said she'd left school separately that day and hadn't walked with. Other classmates were asked if Isabella had mentioned meeting anyone after school, or if anyone had been bothering her. 3 students mentioned something that caught Rivera's attention. A boy in Isabella's English class named David Morales said he'd seen a man in a car parked near the school on Monday and Tuesday, both times around dismissal. He'd noticed because the man had been watching students leave, which had seemed weird. David described the car as dark-colored, maybe blue or black, older model, maybe from the 80s. He couldn't remember the make or the license plate. 2 other students, both 8th graders, corroborated seeing a similar car parked near the school. One girl said the driver had been a Hispanic, maybe in his 40s, with a mustache. She'd noticed because he'd been there multiple days and hadn't appeared to be picking anyone up. Rivera put out a bulletin for officers to look for a dark, older model vehicle near Edison Middle School, and to question anyone matching the description. By Thursday, the local Spanish-language news stations were running Isabella's story. Univision and Telemundo both led with it on their evening broadcasts. Isabella's school photo, her smile, her dark hair. ¿Dónde está Isabella? Where is Isabella? Tips started coming in. Most were well-meaning but useless. Someone thought they'd seen her at a mall. Someone else thought they'd seen her getting into a bus. Neither sighting panned out. Roberto and Carmen appeared on television Friday night, sitting together on a couch in the studio, Carmen crying as she begged anyone who knew anything to come forward. Roberto sat with his hand on his wife's hand, his face composed, but his eyes showing the strain of 3 sleepless nights. Si alguien tiene a nuestra hija, por favor, devuélvanosla, Carmen said through tears. If someone has our daughter, please, return her to us. Ella es todo para nosotros. She is everything to us. The segment ran on both Univision and Telemundo and was picked up by the English-language stations as well. The phone lines at the police tip number received over 200 calls in the 48 hours after it aired. None of them led to Isabella. By the end of the first week, Rivera had conducted over 100 interviews, checked surveillance footage from every business along 8th Street, and run background checks on every registered sex offender within a 5-mile radius of Edison Middle School. The man in the dark car had not been located. The vehicle had not been identified. No witnesses to an actual abduction had come forward. Isabella Reyes had simply disappeared. For 3 months, the investigation into Isabella Reyes's disappearance proceeded along the standard paths of a missing child case. Police followed leads. The family organized searches. The media coverage continued. By December, the active urgency had started to fade in the way it does when cases don't break quickly, settling into the slower rhythm of a mystery without answers. And then on January 7, 1993, FBI agents in coordination with Miami police arrested 17 people across South Florida in connection with a human trafficking operation that had been under federal investigation for 6 months. The operation was unlike anything law enforcement had seen before in South Florida. It wasn't smuggling people into the United States. It was smuggling children out of the United States and back to Cuba. The network had been operating since early 1992, targeting Cuban-American families in Miami, whose children had been born in the US or had come over as infants and therefore had no memory of Cuba. The network was funded by a wealthy Cuban businessman named Emilio Vega, based in Havana, who had built his fortune in the years after the revolution through connections to the Castro government, and who had developed what FBI investigators would later describe as a messianic complex about reuniting Cuban families. Vega's philosophy, as investigators pieced it together from intercepted communications and testimony from arrested members, was that Cuban children being raised in the United States were being stolen from their heritage, brainwashed by American capitalism, and needed to be returned to Cuba to be raised properly. The network he funded operated through recruiters who identified potential targets in Miami's Cuban communities. They looked for families with children in the right age range, typically 10 to 15. They looked for children who fit specific criteria, born in the United States, or brought over as infants, meaning they had no real memory of Cuba and could be more easily integrated into Cuban society. They looked for families where both parents worked, where children walked to and from school without adult supervision, where daily routines were predictable and could be observed and exploited. They watched schools. They watched neighborhood. They identified children whose patterns made them vulnerable. They documented everything: what time a child left for school, what route they took, whether they walked alone or with friends, where the potential intervention points were, when and where an abduction could be executed with minimal risk of witnesses. The recruiters would observe for weeks, sometimes months. They'd photograph targets from a distance. They'd compile dossiers with photos, schedules, family information, addresses. These dossiers would be sent to Vega's organization in Cuba, where decisions would be made about which children to prioritize based on factors the FBI never fully understood. Age was one factor. Gender seemed to matter, with a slight preference for girls. Family connections in Cuba were important. Children whose grandparents or aunts or uncles still lived on the island were preferred, because it gave the operation a veneer of family reunification that made it easier to justify to the Cuban families who would ultimately receive the children. Once a target was selected, the network moved to the contact. Sometimes they'd approach the child directly, which was risky, but could be effective with younger children who were taught to trust adults and who might not question a stranger claiming to have a message from family in Cuba. Sometimes they'd approach the parents first, pretending to offer services related to getting messages to relatives on the island or helping with visa applications for family visits. These approaches were designed to build trust, to make the network members seem like helpful community members rather than predators. The actual abductions were quick, professional, and almost always executed in ways that minimized the chance of witnesses. A car pulling up next to a child walking alone. A brief conversation. The child getting in voluntarily because they'd been told their parent needed them, or because they'd been offered something. The car driving away before anyone nearby registered what had happened. The whole thing could take less than 30 seconds if it was done right. And the network had practiced until they could do it right. Once a child was taken, they were moved quickly through a network of safe houses in South Florida, then smuggled onto boats that made the 90-mile crossing to Cuba. The boats weren't the rickety rafts that Cubans used to escape to America. These were professional vessels, fast enough to make the crossing in hours, equipped with radar and communication systems, operated by people who knew how to avoid detection. In Cuba, the children were delivered to Vega's organization, which placed them with Cuban families who believed they were helping to reunite children with their homeland. Some families were told the children had been orphaned in America and needed home. Some were told the children's parents in Miami had consented to send them back to Cuba to be raised by relatives. The lies varied. The result was children disappearing into Cuban households, given new identities, raised as Cubans, with no way to contact the families they'd been taken from. The FBI had been investigating the network since July 1992. After a 15-year-old boy named Luis Dominguez disappeared from Miami, and his uncle in Havana reported seeing someone who looked like Luis in Santiago de Cuba 2 months later. The uncle had managed to get word to relatives in Miami, who contacted the FBI. The investigation had been slow, careful, gathering evidence, identifying members of the network, waiting for the right moment to dismantle it entirely. The arrests on January 7th took down recruiters, logistics coordinators, boat operators, and safe house operators. All 17 were charged with kidnapping, human trafficking, and conspiracy. Among those arrested was a man named Hector Salinas, 48, who matched the description of the man seen in the dark car near Edison Middle School in October. Detective Rivera learned about the arrests through a call from an FBI agent named Catherine Ruiz, who'd been coordinating the trafficking investigation. She told him they had someone in custody who might be connected to his missing girl case. Rivera was at the federal building within an hour. Hector Salinas had been one of the network's primary recruiters. He'd been operating in Miami since the network's formation in '92. His job was identifying targets and executing the actual abductions. He'd been arrested at a safe house in Homestead where 2 children were being held before transport to Cuba. Both children had been taken in December and were returned to their families within hours. The FBI let Rivera sit in on Salinas had already been read his rights. He had a lawyer. He was cooperating to a degree, providing names and information about the network's structure. But he was selective about what he admitted to personally. Rivera asked him about Isabella Reyes, showed him her photo, asked if he'd taken her. Salinas looked at the photo for a long time. Then he said he recognized her, but he hadn't taken her. Rivera asked if someone else in the network had taken her. Salinas said he didn't know. Different members operated independently. He didn't always know what everyone else was doing. Rivera asked about the dark car near Edison Middle School in October. Salinas admitted he'd been surveilling that school. Said he'd been looking at multiple potential targets. Said he remembered seeing Isabella because she'd fit the profile, but he said he hadn't taken her because she'd never been alone long enough. He said she'd usually walked with friends and he'd decided she wasn't a good target. Rivera asked if anyone else in the network might have taken her. Salinas said it was possible, but he didn't have information about that. The FBI interviewed all 17 arrested members about Isabella Reyes. 3 others besides Salinas admitted they'd seen her photo during target selection meetings. They said Vega's organization in Cuba had been asking for girls in Isabella's age range. They said Isabella had been discussed as a potential target because of her age, and because her grandmother in Cuba had expressed interest in seeing her granddaughters. This was when Rivera understood what had happened. Carmen's mother in Havana, the phone call 2 weeks before Isabella disappeared, hadn't been a normal family call. It had been part of the network's process. Vega's people identified Cuban families with relatives in Miami, contacted the Cuban relatives, convinced them to make calls expressing interest in seeing their American family members, used those calls to identify targets. Carmen's mother had unknowingly helped target her own granddaughter, but knowing this didn't tell them definitively what had happened to Isabella. 2 members of the network said they'd been told Isabella had been successfully taken and transported to Cuba in late October. 2 others said they'd been told she hadn't been taken, that the operation had been aborted. The testimonies contradicted each other. Hector Salinas maintained he hadn't taken her. Another recruiter named Miguel Torres said he had been involved in her abduction, but that it had been executed by a 3rd man who'd since fled to Cuba. Torres said Isabella had been transported on a boat that left from Key Largo on October 15th, 2 days after she disappeared. But Torres couldn't provide details that proved he was telling the truth. He didn't know which safe house she'd been held in. He didn't know the boat's name or the captain's name. His account felt like someone trying to take credit for something he'd heard about but hadn't actually done. The FBI spent weeks trying to verify what had happened. They checked boat traffic from Key Largo in mid-October. They interviewed other members about boats and transport schedules. They found documentation of a boat departure on October 15th that fit the general timeline, but they couldn't prove Isabella had been on it. The trials of the 17 network members began in May 1993 and continued through the fall. The prosecution was handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida, with extensive FBI support. The defendants were tried in 3 separate proceedings based on their level of involvement. The first trial covered the leadership, the recruiters and logistics coordinators who'd planned operations. The second covered the transport operators, the boat captains and safe house managers. The third covered the peripheral members who'd provided support, but hadn't directly participated in abductions. Hector Salinas and Miguel Torres were in the first trial. Both faced kidnapping charges related to confirmed cases where children had been taken and recovered. Both faced charges related to Isabella Reyes specifically. The evidence in the confirmed cases was overwhelming. The FBI had testimony from recovered children describing how they'd been taken. They had testimony from safe house operators describing which children had been held where. They had boat manifests and communication records. and financial documents showing payments from Vega's organization in Cuba. The evidence related to Isabela Reyes was more ambiguous. The prosecution presented testimony from multiple network members saying Isabela had been discussed as a target. They presented the timeline of Carmen's mother's phone call and the network's pattern of using family contacts to identify targets. They presented the descriptions from Isabela's classmates, matching Hector Salinas and matching his vehicle. They presented Miguel Torres's testimony that Isabela had been taken and transported on October 15. The defense countered that Torres's testimony was unreliable, that he was trying to reduce his sentence by claiming involvement in a high-profile case, that he couldn't provide verifiable details about Isabela's abduction because he hadn't actually been involved in it. The defense presented Salinas' testimony that he'd surveilled Edison Middle School but hadn't taken Isabela. They argued that Isabela's disappearance might not have been connected to the network at all, that correlation wasn't causation, that the timing was coincidental. Roberto and Carmen attended every day of the trial. They sat in the gallery, listening to testimony about a network that stole children, listening to men describe how they'd identified targets and planned abductions, trying to find confirmation that these were the people who'd taken their daughter. The jury convicted Salinas and Torres on charges related to the confirmed abductions, but on the charges related to Isabela Reyes specifically, they returned not guilty verdicts, finding that the prosecution hadn't proven beyond a reasonable doubt that either man had taken her. The judge sentenced both men to long federal prison terms for the confirmed cases, but he noted in his statement that the verdict on Isabela Reyes should not be interpreted as a finding that she hadn't been taken by the network, only that the evidence didn't definitively prove which member had taken her. It was the worst possible outcome for Roberto and Carmen. The network was real. Isabela fit the profile. The timeline matched. But nobody could prove conclusively that the network had taken her. And if they had, nobody could say where she'd been sent in Cuba. The FBI continued investigating Emilio Vega in Cuba, but they had no jurisdiction there. The Cuban government denied any knowledge of Vega's network. Cuban authorities claimed no American children had been brought to the island illegally. They provided no assistance with the investigation. In late 1993, the FBI approached Roberto and Carmen with what they'd learned about the network's operation in Cuba. They said that if Isabela had been taken, she would have been placed with a Cuban family somewhere on the island, probably given a new identity, raised as a Cuban child with no knowledge of her. They said finding her would be nearly impossible without cooperation from Cuban authorities, which wasn't forthcoming. They said the best option was to keep her case active, to continue sharing her information with anyone they could, and to hope that someday she'd remember who she was, or that someone would recognize her. In January 1994, 14 months after Isabela disappeared, Roberto and Carmen made their first trip to Cuba. They'd applied for travel visas as soon as the FBI had confirmed the network's Cuban operation. The Cuban government, which at that time was still controlled by Fidel Castro, had denied the initial applications, citing the lack of diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States. But persistent pressure from human rights organizations and media coverage of the trafficking network eventually produced visa approvals for humanitarian purposes. Roberto and Carmen flew to Havana with one suitcase containing clothes, toiletries, and 5,000 copies of a flyer with Isabela's photo and description in Spanish. The flyer showed Isabela's school picture from 8th grade, the same one that had been on television in Miami. Below the photo was text: "Has visto a esta niña? Have you seen this girl?" It gave Isabela's name, her age at disappearance, the date she was taken, and a description. It said she'd been kidnapped from Miami and brought to Cuba against her will. It gave a Miami phone number to call with information. Carmen's mother, who still lived in Havana and who had been devastated to learn her phone call had been used to target Isabela, helped organize their search. She'd contacted everyone she knew, spread the word through the neighborhood, through church groups, through informal networks of communication that existed in a society where official channels were controlled by the state. Roberto and Carmen spent 2 weeks in Cuba on that first trip. They posted flyers on walls and telephone poles in Havana. They handed them out on street corners. They talked to anyone who would listen, showing Isabela's photo, asking if anyone had seen a girl who matched her description, or who seemed out of place, who didn't quite fit her family, who might have memories of life in America. They visited schools, showing Isabela's photo to teachers and administrators, asking if any student had enrolled in 1992 who matched her description. Most administrators were cooperative to a point, but none produced records of any new student matching Isabela's profile. They visited churches, community centers, markets, anywhere people gathered. They talked until they were hoarse. They showed the photo until the copies were worn thin from handling. Nobody recognized Isabela, or if they did, nobody was willing to say so. The Cuban government's position was that no American children had been brought to Cuba illegally. Officials they met with were polite but unhelpful. They acknowledged that trafficking networks existed in various forms, but said they had no evidence of American children being placed with Cuban families. They said Roberto and Carmen were welcome to search, but the government couldn't provide assistance with something they maintained hadn't happened. Roberto and Carmen returned to Miami in February 1994 with the same 5,000 flyers, mostly still bundled in boxes, because there were only so many corners you could stand on, only so many walls you could post to, only so many hands you could press a flyer into before exhaustion and heartbreak made you stop. But they went back. They went back in 1995, staying 3 weeks, covering more ground, visiting Santiago de Cuba and Camagüey and Santa Clara. They posted flyers, they talked to people, they searched, they found nothing. They went back in 1997, in 1999, in 2003, in 2007, in 2012, 7 trips over 20 years, each one following the same pattern. Arrive in Havana, visit Carmen's mother who was aging and eventually dying, and who never stopped feeling responsible for the phone call even though it wasn't her fault, even though everyone told her she'd been manipulated, even though intellectually she understood that calling her daughter to ask about her granddaughters was a normal thing for a grandmother to, and she couldn't have known it would be used to target Isabella. Post flyers, talk to people, show the photo, ask questions, walk until their feet ached, talk until their voices were hoarse, leave exhausted and empty-handed, and feeling like they'd abandoned their daughter all over again every time they got on a plane back to Miami. Each trip cost money they didn't have in abundance. Roberto's business did well enough, but they weren't wealthy. Each trip to Cuba meant flights, accommodations, visas, the cost of printing thousands of flyers, the cost of taking time away from work. Their families helped when they could. Their church took collections. The Cuban-American community in Miami raised funds specifically for the search efforts, understanding that what happened to Isabella could have happened to any of their children. Each trip cost something beyond money. Each one meant confronting the reality that Isabella might be alive on this island, and they might walk past her on the street and not recognize her. Each one meant seeing young women who resembled Isabella and feeling their hearts stop before realizing it wasn't her. Each one meant the emotional exhaustion of hope repeatedly crushed, of leads that went nowhere, of people who promised information and then disappeared, of a bureaucracy that was polite but obstructive, of a government that insisted the thing they were searching for didn't exist. On the 2003 trip, they brought an age-progressed photo showing what Isabella might look like at 24. The image showed a young woman with Isabella's dark hair and eyes, matured features, the same smile. They posted that photo alongside the original 8th grade photo. The caption said, "Ella fue raptada cuando tenía 13 años. Ahora tendría 24. ¿La reconoces? She was kidnapped when she was 13. Now she'd be 24. Do you recognize her?" On that trip, something changed. 2 different people, in different parts of Havana, approached Carmen separately and quietly told her they'd seen a woman who looked like the age-progressed photo. Both said the woman was in her 20s, worked at a government office, seemed educated and well-adjusted. Neither could provide an address or a full name. Both seemed nervous about having the conversation at all. Roberto and Carmen spent days trying to track down the woman based on the vague descriptions they'd been given. They visited government offices. They watched from street corners. They never found anyone they could definitively identify as potentially being Isabella. But the fact that 2 people had recognized the age-progressed image and connected it to a real person gave them something they hadn't had before. It gave them hope that Isabella was alive, that she was living somewhere in Cuba, possibly without knowing who she really was. On the 2007 trip, it happened again, this time in Santiago de Cuba. A man approached Roberto outside a church and said he knew a woman in her late 20s who looked exactly like the photo Roberto was showing. He said the woman had a family, worked as a teacher, seemed happy. He said he didn't want to cause trouble for her, but he thought Roberto should. Roberto tried to get more information. The man wouldn't give specifics, said he'd already said too much, walked away. Carmen and Roberto spent that entire trip in Santiago, walking neighborhoods, visiting schools, hoping to see the woman the man had described. They saw women who resembled Isabella. They saw women who might be about the right age. They never saw anyone they could approach with certainty. The same pattern repeated in 2012, this time in Camagüey. A woman approached Carmen in a market and whispered that there was someone working at the university who looked like the aged photo of Isabella. She said the woman was married, had children, didn't seem like someone who'd been kidnapped as a child. Carmen tried to get a name. The woman shook her head, said she couldn't get involved, left quickly. Each sighting was vague enough that it couldn't be confirmed. Each one was specific enough that it felt real. Each one reinforced the possibility that Isabella was alive in Cuba, living a life under a different name, possibly not knowing her own history. But none of the sightings led to actually finding her. None of the people who claimed to recognize the photos would provide enough information to make contact. The logistics of finding one specific person in a country of 11 million people, without government assistance, without official records, with a population that had learned through decades of authoritarian rule not to talk to strangers asking questions, made the task nearly impossible. While Roberto and Carmen searched Cuba, the FBI continued investigating the trafficking network's operations and its Cuban connections through the 1990s and into the 2000s. The 17 arrested members were all eventually convicted and sentenced to federal prison terms ranging from 15 to 35 years. Hector Salinas received 30 years. Miguel Torres received 28. In prison, some members became more cooperative over time, providing additional information about the network's structure and operations. Through prisoner debriefings conducted between 1995 and 2000, the FBI learned more about how the Cuban end of the operation worked. Emilio Vega, the Cuban businessman who'd funded and directed the network, was never arrested. He remained in Cuba, protected by his connections to the Castro government. His business empire grew through the 1990s as Cuba's economy struggled, and opportunists like Vega found ways to profit from the desperation. The FBI estimated that between 1992 and when the network was dismantled in January 1993, approximately 23 children had been taken from South Florida and transported to Cuba. 7 had been recovered when the network was arrested, found in safe houses before transport. The other 16 had been successfully moved to Cuba. Of those 16, only 3 had been located and returned to their families by 2000. All 3 had been found through extraordinary circumstances. One recognized himself in an age-progressed photo broadcast on Cuban television during a brief period of media openness in 1995. One was recognized by a Cuban defector who'd known the family he'd been placed with. And one was found when the Cuban family that had taken him contacted Miami relatives to facilitate a reunion after learning the child's true history. The other 13 remained missing, their locations unknown, their fates uncertain. Isabella Reyes was among them. The trafficking network's exposure led to increased scrutiny of child abduction patterns in Miami's Cuban community through the 1990s. Additional smaller networks were identified and dismantled. The Cuban-American community became more vigilant about strangers approaching children or asking questions about families. Schools implemented stricter pickup protocol. The kind of opportunistic surveillance that Hector Salinas had conducted outside Edison Middle School became much harder to execute without being noticed and reported. But for the families of the 13 missing children, the improvements in security meant nothing. Their children were gone. They were growing up in Cuba with different names, different families, different lives. Whether they knew who they really were remained an open question. In 2003, Cuban-American Congress members from Florida introduced legislation to pressure Cuba to cooperate with investigations into the trafficking network and to assist in locating the missing children. The legislation passed, but had no practical effect. Cuba continued to maintain that no American children had been brought to the island illegally. Advocates for the missing families tried multiple approaches through the 2000s. They appealed to international human rights organizations. They lobbied the United Nations. They worked with journalists to keep the stories alive. Some progress was made in raising awareness, but no progress was made in actually finding the missing children. In 2008, when Raúl Castro took over from Fidel, there was brief hope that Cuba's position might soften. Roberto and Carmen, along with other families, sent a letter directly to Raúl Castro requesting assistance. They received no response. When diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States were restored in 2015 under the Obama administration, the families again pushed for cooperation on locating the missing children. The U.S. government included the issue in negotiations. Cuba acknowledged the requests, but provided no substantive assistance. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Finding someone in Cuba who didn't want to be found, or who didn't know they were supposed to be looking for their real family, required resources and cooperation that didn't exist. Roberto Reyes is 74 years old today. He retired from his roofing business in 2015, sold it to one of his longtime employees, and spends most of his time now at home with Carmen, or at the small Catholic church in Westchester where they've been members for 40 years. He still thinks about Isabella every day. He says it in interviews, says it to the support group for families of missing children that he and Carmen attend monthly, says it to anyone who asks. Not a day goes by. Not a single day in 32 years. He's become quieter as he's aged. More internal with his grief. He doesn't talk about Cuba as much as he used to. He doesn't talk about the trips they made or the women they saw who might have been Isabella. He's reached an understanding with uncertainty that took decades to arrive at. An acceptance that he may never know what happened to his daughter, but that not knowing doesn't mean he can stop. Carmen Reyes is 71. She still works part-time at the bridal shop 2 days a week because the work gives her something to focus on, and because sitting at home thinking about Isabella is worse than being busy. Her mother in Cuba died in 2016. Never having stopped blaming herself for the phone call, never having been able to help find her granddaughter despite years of trying. Carmen is the one who keeps Isabella's story alive now. She does interviews whenever someone asks. She updates Isabella's missing persons profile with new age-progressed images every few years. The most recent image, released in 2023, shows Isabella as a 45-year-old woman, with gray starting in her dark hair, lines around her eyes, the mature face of someone living a full adult life somewhere. Carmen says she knows Isabella is alive. She says a mother knows these. She says she would feel it if Isabella were dead, and she doesn't feel it. So Isabella must be somewhere living her life. And someday Carmen will find her, or Isabella will find them. Sophia is 57 years old, married, living in Tampa, working as a financial advisor. She has 3 children, all adults now. She named her youngest daughter Isabella, after the sister she lost when she was 15. She stays in touch with her parents, visits regularly, but she's made peace with something her parents haven't been able to make peace with. The probability that Isabella is gone in the permanent sense, or if she's alive, that she's been gone so long she doesn't remember being Isabella Reyes. Sophia says the hardest part is watching her parents hold on to hope, when all evidence suggests hope is futile. She says she loves them for their persistence, but she worries about what happens when they're not around anymore, when the responsibility for keeping Isabella's case active falls to her, when she has to decide whether to keep searching for a sister who disappeared when they were teenagers, and who's now lived more of her life as whoever she became than as who she was. The house on the corner of Westchester where Isabella lived is still Roberto and Carmen's house. They've updated some things over the years, but Isabella's bedroom remains largely preserved. Not exactly as it was in 1992, but close enough. The piano Isabella had been learning on is in the living room, covered, unplayed for 3 decades except for when grandchildren visit, and Carmen lets them touch the keys and tells them about their Aunt Isabella, who loved music. The Miami Police Department keeps Isabella's case open. The detective currently assigned to it is a woman named Laura Mendez, who was 3 years old when Isabella disappeared, and who's been working the case since 2018. She reviews it quarterly, follows up on any tips that come in, and maintains regular contact with Roberto and Carmen. Tips still come in occasionally, though less frequently than they did in the first year. Someone thinks they saw a woman in Cuba who looked like the age-progressed photo. Someone read about the case online and wants to share a theory. Someone claims to have information about the trafficking network. Mendez checks every tip. None of them have led anywhere conclusive. The FBI's case on the trafficking network is closed. All members who were arrested have either completed their sentences or died in prison. Hector Salinas died in federal prison in 2019. Miguel Torres is still incarcerated, now 77 years old, still maintaining that he was involved in Isabella's abduction, even though he can't prove. Emilio Vega, the Cuban businessman who funded the network, died in Havana in 2018. He was 91. He died wealthy, connected, and never prosecuted for his role in stealing children. His obituary in Cuban state media made no mention of the trafficking. It described him as a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist who'd contributed to Cuban society for decades. When Roberto and Carmen learned of his death, they felt nothing. Not relief, not anger, not closure. Just the hollow recognition that the man most responsible for what happened to Isabella had lived a long, comfortable life and died without facing consequence. 32 years after Isabella Reyes disappeared, the question of what happened to her on October 13, 1992, remains partially answered and partially open. The trafficking network was real. It operated in Miami. It targeted Cuban-American children. It smuggled them to Cuba. These are facts, proven in federal court, documented in FBI records, confirmed by the recovered children, and the convicted network. The question is whether Isabella Reyes was one of the children they took. The evidence suggesting she is substantial. The timing of her disappearance coincided with the network's operational period. She matched the profile of children the network targeted. Her grandmother's phone call 2 weeks before she vanished matched the network's pattern of using family contacts for reconnaissance. Hector Salinas was surveilling her school. Multiple network members said she'd been discussed as a target. Miguel Torres claimed she'd been taken and transported to Cuba. The evidence proving definitively that she was taken by the network is absent. No witness saw her abduction. No member could provide verifiable details about where she was held or which boat she was transported on. The contradictions in testimony from network members created reasonable doubt about whether any of them actually took her. The possibility exists that Isabella was taken by someone else entirely, for different reasons, and that the coincidence of timing made it look like the network's work when it wasn't. The possibility exists that Isabella was taken by the network, but by a member who was never arrested, who escaped to Cuba before the January 1993 raids, and whose involvement was never documented. The possibility exists that Isabella is alive in Cuba today, living under a different name, possibly knowing who she really is and choosing not to reveal it, possibly not knowing at all. The sightings Roberto and Carmen have accumulated over 7 trips to Cuba suggest someone matching Isabella's description exists on the island. The fact that multiple people in different cities at different times have recognized the age-progressed images and connected them to real women suggests those images are accurate, that whoever Isabella became, she looks like what the forensic artists predicted. But none of those sightings have led to confirmation. None of the people who said they recognized the photos were willing to provide enough information to make contact. The reasons for their reluctance vary. Fear of government reprisal for talking to Americans asking sensitive questions, unwillingness to disrupt someone's life based on a resemblance to a decades-old photo, or simple inability to provide details they didn't have. The Cuban government's consistent refusal to cooperate has made verification impossible. Even if Roberto and Carmen could identify a specific woman they believed was Isabella, approaching her directly could put her at risk if she's been living under a false identity for 32 years. The complications of trying to reunite a family torn apart by trafficking in a country that denies the trafficking occurred are too complex to resolve without official support. Roberto and Carmen have considered traveling to Cuba one more time. They talk about it occasionally, usually around October 13th, the anniversary of Isabella's disappearance. They're both in their 70s. Travel is harder. The emotional cost is higher. The probability of success has never been lower, but they haven't entirely ruled it out. Carmen says she'll keep going as long as she can walk and talk, and show Isabella's photo to anyone who'll look at it. Roberto is less certain, but hasn't said no. The case of Isabella Reyes represents something larger than one missing girl. It represents the vulnerability of immigrant communities to exploitation. It represents the way political divisions between countries create spaces where criminals operate with impunity. It represents the particular cruelty of family separation when the separation is forced, unexpected, and irreversible through normal channels. It represents the way 13 years old is simultaneously childhood and almost adulthood, the age where Isabella was old enough to remember who she was, but young enough that growing up in a different culture could reshape her entirely, make her someone else, leave her original identity as something that exists only in her earliest memories if it exists at all. If Isabella is alive in Cuba, she's 45 years old. She's lived 32 years as whoever she became. She's lived more than twice as long as someone else than she lived as Isabella Reyes. The 13-year-old girl who walked out of Edison Middle School in 1992 exists now only in photos and memories, and in whatever fragments of that girl remain in the woman she became. Whether that woman knows who she really is, whether she spent 32 years looking for a way home, or 32 years having forgotten she ever had a different home, nobody can say. If you have any information about Isabella Reyes, if you were in Miami in 1992 and saw anything related to her disappearance, if you're in Cuba and have seen someone who matches her description or the age-progressed images, please contact the Miami Police Department or the FBI. If you are Isabella Reyes, or if you think you might be, your family is still looking for you. Your parents are still in Miami. They've never stopped loving you. They've never stopped searching. Whatever life you've lived, whatever name you've gone by, they want you to know that you're Isabella Reyes, and you have a family who wants you home. Subscribe to this channel to follow cases like this one. Share this story. Tell someone who might have information. Keep Isabella's face in circulation. Keep her name alive, because somewhere she exists. And the only way she comes home is if enough people see her story and recognize something that leads to answers. We'll see you in the next one.